Moskowitz here. Welcome to Chapter 7, Part 1, The Sounding of the Call. This is where we're going to learn how the title is connected to the theme and the overall essence of the story. Where we left off, Buck had just won John Thornton $1,600, which nowadays would be like $50,000. So all of these men are very wealthy. So this kind of changes the course of John Thornton's destiny and gives him options that he wouldn't have normally had before. All right, so the sounding of the call. When Buck earned $1,600 in 5 minutes for John Thornton, he made it possible for his master to pay off certain debts and to journey with partners into the East after a fabled lost mine, the story of which was as old as the history of the country. Many men had sought it, few had found it, and more than a few there were who had never returned from the quest. This lost mine was steeped in tragedy and shrouded in mystery, and no one knew of the first men. The old tradition stopped before it got back to him. And from the beginning, there had been an ancient and ramshackle cabin. Dying men had sworn to it, and to the mine the site of which it marked, clinching their testimony with nuggets that were unlike any known graded gold in the Northland. So basically, they're going to go follow a mystery of this abandoned gold mine that's out there in the wilderness somewhere. And because they have the luxury, because of this extra money, they're going to pursue this dream that John Thornton has. But no living man had looted this treasure house, and the dead were dead before John Thornton and Pete and Hans, with Buck and half a dozen other dogs, faced into the east on an unknown trail to achieve where men and dogs as good as themselves had failed. They sledded 70 miles up the Yukon, swung to the left to the Stewart River past the Mayo and the McQuestion, and held on until the Stewart itself became a streamlet threading up upstanding peaks which marked the background or backbone of the continent. John Thornton asked little of man or nature. He was unafraid of the wild. With a handful of salt and a rifle, he could plunge into the wilderness and fare wherever he pleased and as long as he pleased. Being in no haste, Indian fashion, he hunted his dinner in the course of the day's travel, and if he failed to find it, like the Indian, he kept on traveling, secure in the knowledge that sooner or later he would come to it. So on this great journey to the east, straight meat was the bill of fare. Ammunition and tools principally made up the load on the sled, and the time card had drawn upon the limitless future. To Buck, it was boundless delight, the hunting, the fishing, the indefinite wandering through strange places. For weeks at a time, they would hold on steadily day after day, and for weeks upon end, they would camp here and there, the dogs loafing and the men burning holes through frozen muck and gravel and washing countless pans of dirt in the heat of the fire. Sometimes they went hungry, sometimes they feasted riotously, according to the abundance of game and the fortune of hunting. Summer arrived, and dogs and men packed on their backs, rafted across Blue Mountain lakes and descended or ascended unknown rivers in slender boats whipsawed from the standing forest. The months came and went, and back and forth they twisted through the uncharted vastness where no men were, and yet where men had been if the lost cabin were true. They went across divides in summer blizzards, shivered under the midnight sun on naked mountains between the timberline and the eternal snows, dropped into summer valleys amid swarming gnats and flies, in the shadows of glaciers, picked strawberries and flowers as ripe as fair as any in the Southland could boast. And in the fall of the year, they penetrated a weird lake country, sad and silent, where wildfowl had been, but where there was no other sign of life, only the blowing of chill winds, the forming of an ice in sheltered places, and the melancholy rippling of waves on lonely beaches. And through another winter they wandered on the obliterated trails of men who had gone before. Once they came upon a path blazed through the forest, an ancient path, and the lost cabin seemed very near. But the path began nowhere and ended nowhere, and it remained mystery, as the man who made it and the reason he made it remained a mystery. Another time they chanced upon the time-graven wreckage of a hunting lodge, and amid the shreds of rotted blankets, John Thornton found a long-barreled flintlock. He knew it for a Hudson Bay Company gun of the young days of the Northwest, when such a gun was worth its height in beaver skins packed flat. And that was all. No hint as to the man who in an early day had reared the lodge and left the gun among the blankets. Spring came on once more, and at the end of all their wandering, that found not the lost cabin, but a shallow place in a broad valley where the gold showed like yellow butter across the bottom of the washing pan. They sought no farther. Each day they worked to earn them thousands of dollars in clean dust and nuggets, and they worked every day. The gold was sacked in moosehide bags, 50 pounds to the bag, and piled like so much firewood outside the Spruce Bough Lodge. Like giants, they told, days flashing on the heels of days like dreams as they heaped the treasure up. So they don't find this cabin they're looking for, but they find another cache of gold in the rivers that they stumble upon. And there's so much gold that the river looks like butter. So this is going to definitely change things for Buck and the other dogs. They have literally no work to do. There's no way that they can help with this gold panning process. So this is going to give Buck a lot of freedom to kind of explore the world around him. There was nothing for the dogs to do save the hauling in of meat now and again that Thornton had killed, and Buck spent long hours musing by the fire. Musing is like meditating or thinking about things. The vision of the short-legged, hairy man came to him more frequently now that there was little work to be done. And often, blinking by the fire, Buck wandered with him in the other world which he remembered. Remember, this is the hairy man from the past. It sparks his primordial urge to kind of tap into his wild self. The word salient means the most important. Okay. The salient thing of this other world seemed fear. When he watched the hairy man sleeping by the fire, head between his knees and hands clasped above, Buck saw that he slept restlessly, with many starts and wakenings, at which times he would peer fearfully into the darkness and fling more wood upon the fire. Did they walk by the beach of a sea where the hairy man gathered shellfish and ate them as he gathered? It was with eyes that roved everywhere for hidden danger and with legs prepared to run like the wind at its first appearance. Through the forest they crept noiselessly, Buck at the hairy man's heels, and they were alert and vigilant, the pair of them, ears twitching and moving and nostrils quivering, for the man heard and smelled as keenly as Buck. The hairy man could spring up into the trees and travel ahead as fast on the ground, swinging by the arms from limb to limb, sometimes a dozen feet apart, letting go and catching, never falling, never missing his grip. In fact, it seemed as much at home among the trees as on the ground, and Buck had memories of nights of vigil spent beneath trees where the hairy man roosted, holding on tightly as he slept. So as Buck dreams, he travels with this prehistoric man and kind of taps into the earliest roots of the connection between dog and man. And this earliest human is much more wild um, and more connected to nature than any human is today. As you can see, they have the same senses that Buck does, this real connection to the wilderness that they have to live off of. And closely akin to the visions of the hairy man was the call, still sounding in the depths of the forest. It filled him with a great unrest and strange desires. It caused him to feel a vague, sweet gladness, and he was aware of wild yearnings and stirrings for he knew not what. Sometimes he pursued the call into the forest, looking for it as though it were a tangible thing, barking softly or defiantly as the mood might dictate. He would thrust his nose into the cool wood moss or into the black soil where long grasses grew and snort with joy at the fat earth smells, or he would crouch for hours as if in concealment behind fungus-covered trunks of fallen trees, wide-eyed and wide-eared to all that moved and sounded about him. It might be, lying thus, that he hoped to surprise this call he could not understand, but he did not know why he did these various things. He was impelled to do them and did not reason about them at all. Niggerheads, just so you know, is a type of plant. It's not the typical usage that you may be aware of this word. So he's getting this call from the wilderness, and he feels compelled to follow it, and he just doesn't know why at this point. And it's going to lead him to explore outside of John Thornton's camp and out into the great, vast wilderness. Irresistible impulses seized him. He would be lying in camp, dozing lazily in the heat of the day, when suddenly his head would lift and his ears cock up, intent and listening, and he would spring to his feet and dash away, and on for hours, through the forest aisles and across the open spaces where the niggerheads bunched. He loved to run down dry water courses and to creep and spy upon the bird life in the woods. For a day at a time, he would lie in the underbrush, where he would watch the partridges drumming and strutting up and down. But especially he loved to run in the dim twilight and the summer midnights, listening to the subdued and sleepy murmurs of the forest, reading signs and sounds as man may read a book, and seeking for the mysterious something that called waking or sleeping at all times for him to come. One night, he sprang from his sleep with a start, eager-eyed nostrils quivering and scenting, his mane bristling in recurrent waves. From the forest came the call, or one note of it, for the call was many-noted, distinct and definite as never before. A long-drawn howl, like yet unlike any noise made by husky dog, and he knew it in the old familiar way as the sound heard before. He sprang through the sleeping camp and in swift silence dashed through the woods. As he drew closer to the cry, he went more slowly with caution in every movement till he came to an open place among the trees and looked out and saw, erect on haunches with nose pointed to the sky, a long, lean timber wolf. He had made no noise, yet it ceased from its howling and tried to sense his presence. Buck stalked into the open, half crouching, body gathered compactly together, tail straight and stiff, feet falling with unwonted care. Every movement advertised commingled threatening and overture of friendliness. It was the menacing truce that marks the meeting of wild beasts that prey. But the wolf fled at the sight of him. He followed with wild leapings in a frenzy to overtake. He ran him into a blind channel in the bed of the creek where the timber jam barred the way. The wolf whirled about, pivoting on his hind legs after the fashion of Joe, an all-cornered husky dog, snarling and bristling, clipping his teeth together in a continuous and rapid succession of snaps. Buck did not attack, but circled him and hedged him in with friendly advances. The wolf was suspicious and afraid, for Buck made 3 of him in weight, while his head barely reached Buck's shoulder. Watching his chance, he darted away, and the chase was resumed. Time and again he was cornered, and the thing repeated, though he was in poor condition, or Buck could not so easily have overtaken him. He would run till Buck's head was even with his flank, when he would whirl around at bay, only to dash away again at the first opportunity. Pertinacity is a determination to keep going no matter what. So throughout in the beginning of this meeting, it's this kind of cat and mouse game where Buck is chasing down the dog and they're kind of half playing, but the wolf is honestly terrified of Buck at this point. Buck is like 3 times as big as this wolf and much better fed. But in the end, Buck's pertinacity, was rewarded, for the wolf, finding that no harm was intended, finally sniffed noses with him. Then they became friendly and played about in the nervous, half-coy way in which fierce beasts belie their fierceness. After some time of this, the wolf started off at an easy lope in a manner that plainly showed he was going somewhere. He made it clear to Buck that he was to come, and they ran side by side through the somber twilight, straight up the creek bed into the gorge from which it was issued, and across the bleak divide where it took to rise. On the opposite side of the watershed, they came down into a level country where were great stretches of forest and many streams, and through these great stretches they ran steadily, hour after hour, the sun rising higher and the day growing warmer. Buck was wildly glad. He knew he was at last answering the call and running by the side of his wood brother toward the place from where the call surely came. Old memories were coming upon him fast, and he was stirring to them as of old he stirred to the realities of which there were shadows. He had done this thing before somewhere in that other and dimly remembered world, and he was doing it again, now running free in the open, the unpacked earth underfoot, and the wide sky ahead. It's almost like he's having this like past life memory of something that happened in the old days. Excuse me, I need 10 more minutes. Sorry. At night, Buck can be wild, running with the wolf, but during the day, he goes back to camp with Thornton. So we're going to see that he's going to actually go back to camp with John Thornton, but he has definitely been changed by this. He has answered the call of the wild, and he found that the woods want him. They stopped by a running stream to drink, and stopping, Buck remembered John Thornton. He sat down. The wolf started on toward the place from where the call surely came, then returned to him, sniffing noses and making actions as though to encourage him. But Buck turned about and started slowly on the back track. For the better part of an hour, the wild brothers ran by his side, whining softly. Then he sat down, pointed his nose upward, and howled. It was a mournful howl, and as Buck held steadily on his way, he heard it grow faint and fainter until it was lost in the distance. So he does love John Thornton, but this call of the wild is something that just triggers him. He can't resist it. The only thing that brings him back into this camp is that John Thornton is the most important thing on the planet to him. John Thornton was eating dinner when Buck dashed into camp and sprang upon him in a frenzy of affection, overturning him, scrambling upon him, licking his face, biting his hand, playing the general tomfool as John Thornton characterized, the while he shook Buck back and forth and cursed him lovingly. For 2 days and nights, Buck never left camp, never left Thornton out of his sight. He followed him about at his work, watched him while he ate, saw him into his blankets at night and out of them in the morning. But after 2 days, the call of the forest began to sound more imperiously or demanding than ever. Buck's restlessness came back to him, and he was haunted by recollections of his wild brother and of the smiling land beyond the divide and the run side by side through the wide forest stretches. Once again he took to wandering in the woods, but the wild brother came no more, and though he listened for the long vigils, the mournful howl was never raised. He began to sleep out at night, staying away from camp for days at a time, and once he crossed the divide at the head of the creek and went back into the land of timber and streams. There he wandered for a week, seeking vainly for fresh sign of the wild brother, killing his meat as he traveled and traveling with the long, easy lope that seemed to never tire. He fished for salmon in the broad stream that emptied somewhere into the sea, and by the stream he killed a large black bear, blinded by the mosquitoes, while likewise fishing and raging through the forest, helpless and terrible. Even so, it was a hard fight and aroused the last remnants of Buck's ferocity. And 2 days later, when he returned to his kill and found a dozen wolverines quarreling over the spoil, he scattered them like chaff, and those that fled left two behind who would quarrel no more. So Buck has now started going into the wilderness for extended amounts of time and killing on the way so that he can eat. So he now has, like, to the point where he's able to kill a bear. The bear was blinded because of the mosquitoes, but still he's able to take down a giant bear. The blood longing became stronger than ever before, and he was a killer, a thing that preyed, living on the things that lived, unaided alone by virtue of his strength and prowess, surviving triumphantly in a hostile environment where only the strong survived. Because of all this, he became possessed of a great pride in himself, which communicated itself like a contagion to his physical being. It advertised itself in all his movements, was apparent in the play of every muscle, spoke plainly as speech in the way he carried himself, and made his glorious furry coat, if anything, more glorious. But for the stray brown on his muzzle and above his eyes, and for the splash of white hair that ran midmost down his chest, he might have been mistaken for a giant wolf, larger than the largest of the breed. From his St. Bernard father he had inherited size and weight, but from his shepherd mother, who had given shape to that size and weight, his muzzle was a long wolf muzzle, save that was larger than the muzzle of any wolf, and his head, somewhat broader, was a wolf head on a massive scale. His cunning was wolf cunning and wild cunning, his intelligence shepherd intelligence and St. Bernard intelligence, and all of this plus an experience gained in the fiercest of schools made him as formidable a creature as any that intelligence roamed the wild. A carnivorous animal living on a straight meat diet, he was in full flower at the high tide of his life, overspilling with vigor and virility. When Thornton passed a caressing hand along his back, a snapping and crackling followed the hand, each hair discharging its pent magnetism at the contact. Every part, brain and body, nerve tissue and fiber was keyed to the most exquisite pitch. And between all the parts, there was a perfect equilibrium and adjustment. So there you have more of that static electricity, that literal static electricity and then the figurative, like the tension mounting in the situation. To sights and sounds and events which required action, he responded with lightning like rapidity. Quickly as a husky dog could leap to defend from attack or to attack, he could leap twice as quickly. He saw the movement and heard sound and responded in less time than another dog required to compass the mere seeing or hearing. He perceived and determined and responded in the same instant. In point of fact, the three actions of perceiving, determining, and responding were sequential, but so infinitesimal were the intervals of time between them that they appeared simultaneous. His muscles were supercharged with vitality and snapped into play sharply like steel springs. Life streamed through him in splendid flood, glad and rampant, until it seemed that it would burst him asunder in sheer ecstasy and pour forth generously over the world. Never was there such a dog, said John Thornton one day as the partners watched Buck marching out of camp. When he was made, the mold was broke, said Pete. By jingo, I think so myself, Hans confirmed. They saw him marching out of camp, but they did not see the instant and terrible transformation which took place as soon as he was within the secrecy of the forest. He no longer marched, and once he became a thing of the wild, stealing along softly, cat-footed, a passing shadow that appeared and disappeared among the shadows. He knew how to take advantage of every cover to crawl on his belly like a snake, and like a snake to leap and strike. He could take a partridge bin from a nest, kill a rabbit as it slept, and snap in midair the little chipmunks fleeing a second too late for the trees. Fish in open pools were not too quick for him, nor were the beaver mending their dams too wary. He killed to eat, not from wantonness, but he preferred to eat what he killed himself. So a lurking humor ran through his deeds, and it was his delight to steal upon the squirrels. And when he all but had them, he let them go, chattering in mortal fear, to the treetops. This is where we're going to stop for today, and we're going to read the second half of the next lesson. At this point, Buck transforms. The second he leaves the camp and goes on these journeys, he goes from this dignified, regal dog to a wild, self-sufficient creature and beast of the wild. When you're done reading this, complete the multiple choice, and then the next lesson is going to be our last because that's the end of the book. So we're going to have to see what happens. Is Buck going to choose John Thornton, or is Buck going to choose to live in the wild permanently?